Hey YouTube! Today I'm going to give you a video tutorial on how to replace the transmission drive shaft output seals on a 1990 Honda CRX SI. The basic principles of what I'm going to show you today is going to essentially apply to almost any Honda that was built probably in the last 30 years or so. Very straightforward to do. It's going to involve me removing, of course, both front wheels, the drive axles, and then ultimately me prying out the seal, and I'll probably even demonstrate how to replace the transmission oil as well on these vehicles. On my particular vehicle, I've also got warped front rotors, so I'm going to remove those as well prior to doing all of this work, so I can actually drop them off the machine shop to get them remachined so they're nice and smooth again. So before we begin, we want to make sure that we jack up the vehicle from the central jack point stand, which is located directly underneath the main rad support on the front. And on this vehicle, and most Hondas, you'll see a little bump on that front cross member. And of course, once I've jacked it up high enough, and in my case really high because I like more working space, you put a jack stand on each side and lower the vehicle onto it. Make sure your parking brake is securely tightened, otherwise, you know, jack stands or not, this vehicle could potentially roll back and crush you. Using an impact gun or just your socket, using a 19mm socket, remove the two front tires. Since I'm going to be removing the brake rotors as well during this service to replace the transmission seals, I might as well go ahead and apply some penetrating lube or equivalent onto the various screws that I'm going to remove. So in this case, these rotor bolts, Phillips bolts, are kind of a nuisance, so I'm going to apply a little bit of lubricant to each side. I'm also going to apply a little bit of lubricant into this area here, which is the upper ball joint, because that's how I take off my axles. The ball joint cover bolts, brake line bolts, as well as the 14mm pinch bolt right here, if you can see that, on the front and back side, by the way, folks, and 17mm lower fork bolt, which is located right here, and on the back side, which is where the nut is as well, so right here. So do that for both sides. Walk away, have a beer, have a smoke, whatever it is that you like doing during your break to allow the oil to penetrate, and then go ahead and start removing the various components. We'll start off by removing the two Phillips screws attaching the rotor to the steering knuckle and wheel hub. I'm going to use a Phillips socket bit because those things can be a nuisance sometimes, and you know, depending on your vehicle, how much rust and corrosion, you might end up having to use a Dremel to cut them out or to drill them out with a drill. But I'm hoping that because I put a whole bunch of anti-seize on these screws before I reinstall them, that I should be able to take them off without much issue. Now, for those that are wondering how you go ahead and remove those without the rotor turning, you're going to take a small screwdriver like this, and then you're going to essentially just kind of shove it into the slotted grooves here, and then basically butt the screwdriver against the brake caliper bracket, so that when you turn it this way to unscrew, that it's going to jam it up against it so it doesn't spin. Okay, I managed to actually get the two Phillips screws off of the rotor, so now this is going to be able to come off. But before we can do so, we need to remove the entire front caliper assembly on both sides. So behind this caliper bracket, there's actually a 17mm bolt holding it in on the top and on the bottom, so you just got to use your impact gun or your wrench and just undo those two, and then essentially hang this brake caliper from the suspension springs or something like that to keep it out of the way, and then this entire rotor assembly will just come right off. As a service tip here, when you're removing the caliper bracket or the caliper assembly off of the front steering knuckle, leave the key in the ignition and turn it to position 2, or sorry, the accessory position, so that you can actually unlock the steering wheel, so that you can actually turn this entire steering knuckle outwards on each side. Reason why is that as you can tell, there's more distance in between here to fit an impact gun than it is if it were straight and you only have this much space behind it. So once I undid the two 17mm bolts holding the caliper body to the steering knuckle, this is what it looks like. I just used a copper strap or wire, whatever you want to use. You just want to hang it off the upper control arm so that you're not putting any undue strain on these hydraulic lines here. You don't want to stress these lines and the crimps here because there's an enormous amount of hydraulic pressure that is exerted on this hose to stop your vehicle. Any indication of a leak or any signs of damage or even cracking, these hoses must be immediately replaced for safety reasons. So pretty much now that this is out of the way, I just simply lift that off and expose the entire steering knuckle and hub assembly. Okay, so I'm just gonna do, earlier you guys saw the shot of the driver's side brake rotor, and this is a shot of the passenger side rotor that's also been removed, and I've hung the brake caliper assembly off of the suspension spring pretty much just with anything that'll get it out of the way. So I'm going to start off, I'm only going to show one side of the vehicle of the work I'm doing because it's essentially the same for the driver's side. But actually, in fact, this vehicle has a oil leak on the right side transmission CV axle output shaft seal, and I'm going to demonstrate how to take everything apart to get access to it, and then ultimately the reassembly process is exactly the opposite, and it is basically the same. So this is what the upper ball joint looks like with the ball joint cap cover removed. So you see there's a little cotter pin right there that we're going to have to remove, and then ultimately we're going to loosen this castle nut just to the point where these little castle bits are just at the base of this threaded assembly. So I've removed the cotter pin and loosened this castle nut, and you can see that I just unscrewed it and left it still screwed on, and so the base of the threads is at the top of little castle bits. The reason why is that we're going to now remove the upper ball joint by hitting on these little nubs here on the side of the upper knuckle. If you can see them properly in the video, but there's a nub here, and then there's a nub on the other side. And basically what that's going to do is that it's going to loosen it so that this whole assembly comes off, and then basically you want to keep that castle nut on there so that when this thing does actually pop off, that it doesn't scrape the threads and strip them. It's basically sort of a safety stop. But what you're going to do is basically you're just going to use your, sort of like a little mini sledge, and then you're just going to hit it. And then once you hit that side, then you're going to hit the left side of this. Sorry guys, I'm holding this by hand. And you just keep doing that back and forth on each side here until that comes off. So right after I literally stopped recording because of the hand shaking of the camera, I gave it a few more blows, and you can see that it's popped off, and you see the nice gap there. So the upper control arm has and the ball joint has let go of the upper portion of the knuckle. So now what we're going to do is that we're going to leave that hooked up for now. We're going to undo the axle nut, and we're also going to then also undo all the different suspension pieces, the 14mm pinch bolt here, and then the 17mm bolt and nut assembly on the fork to swing arm pass-through bolt. Undo the axle nut with a 32mm socket and impact gun. Using a 17mm impact socket as well as a corresponding 17mm wrench, remove the lower pass-through bolt. And use a hammer and just sort of tap it out from the back side here, if you can see that. And then just use your hand and kind of, this will be pretty tight, so what you do is you just kind of wiggle this hub assembly up and down, and that'll just come right out. Using a 14mm impact socket, remove the fork pinch bolt. And then essentially you just want to wiggle this fork back and forth with your two hands and it'll just come right out. And that's the fork assembly removed. So everything should just look like this at this point. And then from here we can now carefully apply some upward pressure on this hub to relieve the strain on the upper control arm and just undo that 17mm castle nut. And this is what everything looks like once you've undone it. So just to put into reference here, this upper control arm, you can see the threads here, they're all intact and there's no damage to it, so that's perfect. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to use a hammer and essentially tap this axle back and then remove it from the hub assembly by tipping it forward. Now if you can't get it out, you use something like this 14mm socket I used earlier just to tap the axle through the wheel hub assembly. So this is why it's important to leave the key in the accessory position so that the steering wheel is unlocked, because for the right side, for example, you want this wheel to come out to the right as much as you can so that it gives you enough clearance to swing this axle away. So I basically tap this axle right through the wheel hub right now, and I just got to kind of wrestle this a little bit and this whole thing will just come right out. So this is what underneath the vehicle looks like, and the drive axle still attached inside the vehicle. So what I'm going to do here to remove this axle is put in an oil pan underneath the vehicle. I'm going to take a pry bar and I'm going to just gently push it in between the axle end and the transmission casing and just pry out, and you'll see that oil begins to come out. And you basically just kind of gently lift the axle assembly away, and that's how you take it out. Now oil's going to begin coming out of this, no big deal. This transmission is actually in fact overfilled, and if there's not enough oil we can always top it up afterwards. So this is the oil seal on the transmission housing. So basically you can see that there's the inner lip there, and what I'm going to do, and I can't film this for you guys, but I'm going to put a long screwdriver in there and I'm going to basically put it in from straight underneath like this, like so, and then pry it out this way against the transmission housing to pop that seal out. So I literally use the same large pry bar that I used to pry the seal out, pry the axle out of the transmission, and that's the old seal here on the left, and here's the new seal on the right. And I mean, it was kind of a little bit of a mess, but to give you a better perspective of things, how I removed it was I took this big pry bar and I just tucked it in very carefully between the transmission and just underneath the lip of the seal, and I just pried up like that, and taking care to make sure that I didn't scratch the metallic transmission housing area around the seal, because once you put a gouge in that, it's always going to leak oil. So be very, very careful and gentle when you're yanking this out. It didn't take any effort actually to pull it out, so it should be pretty straightforward. So before we install the new seal, I'm going to coat this new one with some chassis lube just all around here, and I'm going to use a large socket, probably the one I used to remove the axle nut, just to tap this in. Basically, this portion of the seal needs to be flush with the transmission casing. You don't want to drive it in too deep, otherwise it's going to leak, and if you don't drive it far enough, it's going to leak. And of course, you want to drive it in squarely into the bore of the transmission. Take your time with that one, right? Sometimes I've installed seals and I've actually mangled it because I didn't have the right size seal driver. So you just want to be vigilant on that one. And then of course making sure that inside the transmission casing hole, if you can kind of see it, that it's all free of oil and debris, because you don't want to be driving dirt into the transmission, nor do you want it gouging the edges of the seal or the transmission housing. So I used, on the passenger side of the transmission, a 36mm socket to very gently tap this thing in. In fact, this seal is so easy to install, I probably could have just pushed it in by hand. In fact, I even had to use a small little pick to pry out the upper part of the seal just a hair, because I had driven it in too far. But as you can sort of see here, if you can see, that this portion of the seal ring is flush, essentially flush with the transmission housing here, and that's as far as how far you want to drive it. You don't want to drive it any further, and you can kind of feel around it, and it's pretty uniform, so there's no tears or anything, so you can pretty much reinstall the axle and everything in reverse order. So now that I've completed both the driver side and passenger side transmission CV axle seals, You know, I'm going to basically now top off the transmission with some Honda MTF. The fill plug is just right here. Here's the CVX on the right hand side, and then beside it there's a big 17mm plug. Word of caution, when you're taking that off, be careful not to strip the head of the screw like I did many years ago. It doesn't need to be crazy tight, just snug, and then pretty much that's it. I also made a statement earlier that on the driver's side you had to pull an intermediate shaft off of the vehicle. I totally forgot that this is an EF and not an EG series Civic, so there's actually no intermediate shaft. So the removal of the left-hand axle is exactly the same as how I did the passenger side. And basically the seal installation is the same method. I didn't have to use a 36mm socket this time. I in fact used the 32mm axle socket to just gently tap it in, and I actually had to use a little pry tool to sort of pry out the seal, you know, so it was nice and even in the bore, but just be careful not to nick the seal edges and the transmission housing body itself. But pretty much all you want to do is you want to fill this transmission with MTF until the oil begins to drizzle out of the hole, and then pretty much from that point on you just cap it up and you're good to go. Okay, so this is the final checklist of everything that we're going to just quickly walk through that we had removed and essentially reinstalled on this vehicle. So as you can tell, I have brand new rotors. I had mentioned earlier in my video that I was going to machine the old ones and then reinstall them. The problem was when I took them to get machined, they were too thin, so I said forget it, it's just easier for me to buy new ones and save me some time. So to recap everything, so we replaced the transmission seals, which was a fairly straightforward process. There is not an intermediate shaft on the driver's side of this vehicle because it's a CRX, so it's an EF chassis. But essentially, you know, we took off the upper ball joint. So I tightened the castle nut here. I put the upper ball joint cap back on. I've reinstalled the two 10mm brake hose nuts, or sorry, screws here. I've installed the 14mm pinch bolt right there. I've also double checked the 17mm pass-through bolt, carriage bolt on the bottom. I didn't disconnect the tie rod, so that's okay. I retightened the axle nut. I also put anti-seize on, well actually I put anti-seize on everything, but I put extra anti-seize on these two Phillips rotor retainer screws. Tighten the axle nut, tighten the brake caliper bracket assembly, double check to make sure there's no damage to anything else, and making sure that the axles were seated properly in the transmission. Basically there's no gap between the seal and the end of the CV axle. So that essentially concludes how you'd replace a transmission seal on an EF chassis CRX, but this is applicable to essentially all generations of Hondas that have a double wishbone suspension. So I think that goes all up until 2000, up to the 2000 Honda Civic, to as old as the 88 Civic. One thing that you guys need to keep in mind is that when you do the transmission seal, there is oil that does come out of the transmission. Make sure that you actually do the fill, that you like to fill the transmission, sorry, through the fill hole that I showed earlier in this video. Really important. The last thing you want is your transmission running out of oil and you not actually realizing it. And the other thing, of course, is over the next few days, make sure you pay attention that there's no actual leaks from the transmission itself. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. Rate, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.